The laughter died in Studio 6B. It happened so suddenly that even the Roots stopped mid-beat, their instruments hanging in the air like frozen music. Jimmy Fallon, mid-joke about his guest's retirement party gone wrong, simply stopped talking. His signature smile faded as he looked across his desk at Thomas McKenzie, a 58-year-old retired firefighter whose weathered hands were trembling around his coffee mug. "Thomas," Jimmy said softly, abandoning his prepared questions entirely, "what aren't you telling us?" The studio audience of 240 people fell silent. Camera operators adjusted their lenses instinctively, sensing that whatever was about to happen would need to be captured with precision. In the control room, producers leaned forward, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment breathe. Thomas McKenzie had walked onto the Tonight Show stage 20 minutes earlier as just another guest with a feel-good retirement story. 30 years with the FDNY, hundreds of lives saved, a hero send-off complete with bagpipes and brass buttons. He was supposed to share funny firehouse stories, maybe demonstrate some equipment, give Jimmy a fake firefighter helmet for laughs. But something in his eyes told a different story. "You know," Thomas began, his voice rougher than it had been during the pre-interview, "everyone keeps asking me about my greatest save. The one I'm most proud of." Jimmy nodded encouragingly, expecting another heroic tale. "It was 3 months ago, my last shift before retirement." Thomas paused, staring at something beyond the cameras, beyond the studio, into a memory that clearly haunted him. Apartment building in Queens, 4th floor, fully engulfed. We got the call at 2:47 a.m. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. There was this elderly woman, Mrs. Chen, 82 years old, lived alone. When we got there, the whole building was evacuating, but she wasn't coming out. My captain said to write it off. The structure was compromised. But, Thomas's voice cracked slightly, I could hear her calling for help. Jimmy leaned forward, his entertainer's instincts completely abandoned. This wasn't a talk show anymore. This was a man bearing witness to something profound. I went in, against orders, against protocol, against everything I'd learned in 30 years. Thomas looked directly at Jimmy now, his eyes glassy. Found her in the bathroom, trying to save her cat. Smoke inhalation, barely conscious. I got them both out, 20 seconds before the floor collapsed. The audience held its breath. She looked at me as the paramedics were loading her into the ambulance, grabbed my hand with what little strength she had left and said, "You're my angel. You saved my life." And I couldn't tell her. "Tell her what?" Jimmy asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew this story wasn't heading toward triumph. Thomas McKenzie, a man who had faced flames and death for 3 decades, who had carried unconscious strangers down smoke-filled stairwells and crawled through blazing hallways, broke down completely. I couldn't tell her that while I was saving her house, mine was burning down. The words hit the studio like a physical force. Several audience members gasped audibly. Jimmy's mouth fell open slightly. "The same fire," Thomas continued, tears now streaming down his face, "started in the basement of her building, spread through the shared wall to the building next door. My building, my apartment where I'd lived for 15 years, where I kept everything that mattered to me." Behind the scenes, something unprecedented happened. The Tonight Show's director, a man who had overseen thousands of tapings, made a decision that defied every network protocol. He signaled to keep the cameras rolling, but to stop cutting between shots. This moment needed to be captured in real time, without edits, without the usual rhythm of television production. Jimmy Fallon stood up from behind his desk. It was such an unusual move that the audience stirred slightly, uncertain what was happening. He walked around to Thomas's chair and, without hesitation, pulled up the guest chair next to him. "Thomas," Jimmy said, his voice stripped of all performance, all entertainment value, "tell me about what you lost." "Everything," Thomas whispered. "Photo albums from when my kids were small. My father's firefighter badge from when he served in the 60s. My wife's wedding dress that she'd kept for our daughter. 30 years of reports, commendations, memories, all of it. Jimmy reached over and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. The gesture was so natural, so unscripted, that it transcended television entirely. But you know what the worst part is? Thomas continued. Mrs. Chen sends me a card every week, every single week since that night, thanking me for saving her life, for being her hero. And I can't tell her that while I was being her hero, I couldn't save the things that made me, me. The camera caught Jimmy's expression changing. This wasn't the comedian anymore, or the late-night host who made millions laugh every night. This was Jimmy Fallon, the human being, processing something that had shaken him to his core. Thomas, Jimmy said, and his voice was different now, deeper, more serious than his audience had perhaps ever heard it. Do you know what makes someone a hero? Thomas shook his head. It's not what you save, it's what you're willing to lose to save others. The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't the typical late-night show applause. It was something organic, something that came from a place of recognition and shared humanity. But Jimmy wasn't finished. He stood up again and walked to his desk, pulling open a drawer that cameras had never shown before. From it, he retrieved a small box, worn at the edges. Thomas, I want to show you something, Jimmy said, returning to his seat beside the retired firefighter. This belonged to my father. He opened the box to reveal a simple silver watch, its face scratched from years of wear. My dad wasn't a firefighter. He was just a regular guy, worked in sales. But when I was 12, we were at the beach in Jersey, and a kid got caught in a riptide. Without thinking, my dad dove in. Couldn't swim that well, but he got that kid to shore. Jimmy's voice was thick with emotion now. He lost his watch that day. This watch. Current pulled it right off his wrist. He was devastated because it was a gift from his father. But you know what he told me later? Thomas was listening intently, his own tears mixing with something that looked like hope. He said, Jimmy, some things are worth losing if it means someone else gets to keep everything. Jimmy placed the watch in Thomas's hands. I found this in a pawn shop 3 years later, bought it with my allowance money and gave it to him for Father's Day. He wore it every day until he died. The studio was completely silent now. Even the technical crew had stopped moving. I want you to have it, Jimmy said, because 30 years ago, my dad saved one kid. But you, Thomas McKenzie, you saved hundreds. And the fact that you lost everything while saving Mrs. Chen doesn't make you less of a hero. It makes you exactly the kind of hero the world needs. Thomas looked down at the watch, then back at Jimmy, then at the audience that was now openly crying. But Jimmy, he said softly, I don't deserve this. I just did my job. No, Jimmy replied, standing up and helping Thomas to his feet. You did something more important than your job. You proved that some people are worth saving, even when it costs you everything. What happened next was completely unscripted, unprecedented in the history of late-night television. Jimmy Fallon hugged Thomas McKenzie, not the quick, camera-friendly embrace typical of TV, but a real hug, the kind a son gives a father, the kind one human being gives another when words aren't enough. The audience rose to their feet, not because they were prompted to, not because an applause sign lit up, but because they understood they had witnessed something sacred. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. As the applause continued, Jimmy walked to the main camera, the one that broadcast to millions of viewers across America. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying a gravity that transcended entertainment, I need to tell you something. Thomas McKenzie represents something that we don't see enough of anymore. He represents the kind of person who runs toward danger when everyone else runs away, who makes impossible choices and lives with the consequences. He paused, looking directly into the lens. But more than that, he represents something else. He represents the idea that our worth isn't measured by what we keep, but by what we're willing to give up for others.
Jimmy turned back to Thomas, who was still standing center stage, still holding the watch. "Thomas, I have one more thing for you." From the wings of the stage, 3 figures emerged. A woman in her 80s, walking slowly but deliberately, accompanied by 2 younger people. Thomas's face went white. "Mrs. Chen?" he whispered.
The elderly woman approached him with tears in her eyes, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. McKenzie," she said in accented English, her voice strong despite her age, "I have something that belongs to you." She handed him the package. With trembling hands, Thomas unwrapped it to reveal a singed but recognizable photograph. A young Thomas in his dress uniform standing next to a woman in a wedding dress. "How did you?" Thomas began. "After the fire," Mrs. Chen explained, "I went back to look at the damage. I found this in the rubble between our buildings. I've been keeping it safe, hoping someday I could return it to the angel who saved my life." The studio fell silent again as Thomas stared at the photograph, his wedding picture that he thought had been lost forever. "But this isn't why I came tonight," Mrs. Chen continued. "I came because I wanted to tell you something I couldn't say that night in the ambulance." She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. "For 30 years, I saved money from my pension, every month a little bit. I was saving for my funeral so I wouldn't be a burden to anyone. But after you saved me, I realized something. The money should go to someone who saves lives, not someone who's ready to leave this world." She pressed the envelope into Thomas's hands. "This is $47,000. I want you to have it, not because you're my hero, though you are, but because heroes shouldn't have to choose between saving others and saving themselves." Thomas opened the envelope, looked at the contents, then at Mrs. Chen, then at Jimmy, then at the audience that was now sobbing openly. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," she replied firmly, "because 30 years ago, someone taught me that in America, we take care of each other. And 3 months ago, you proved that lesson is still true." Jimmy Fallon, who had made a career out of being funny, who had hosted thousands of hours of television, who had interviewed the biggest stars in the world, found himself completely speechless. But Thomas wasn't finished. He looked out at the audience, then at the cameras, then back at Mrs. Chen. "You know what?" he said, his voice growing stronger. "I've spent 3 months thinking I failed that night, thinking I wasn't a good enough firefighter because I couldn't save my own home while I was saving someone else's. But standing here now, looking at this incredible woman who saved this picture for me, holding this watch from Jimmy's father, I realized something." He paused, composing himself. "I didn't lose everything that night. I lost things, objects, memories stored in photographs and keepsakes, but I didn't lose what matters most. I didn't lose the ability to help people. I didn't lose the courage to run into burning buildings. And I didn't lose the knowledge that every single life is worth saving." The applause that followed was different from anything The Tonight Show had ever heard. It wasn't entertainment applause. It was the sound of recognition, of gratitude, of a studio full of people who had been reminded what courage actually looks like. Jimmy walked back to his desk, but instead of sitting down, he stood behind it, looking out at his audience and at the cameras. "Folks," he said, "we're going to end tonight's show a little differently. We're not going to do our usual goodbye. Instead, I want to leave you with something Thomas just taught us." He looked at Thomas, who was still standing center stage with Mrs. Chen beside him. "Sometimes, the most heroic thing you can do is the thing that costs you everything. And sometimes, just sometimes, the world finds a way to give it back." The show ended not with music or comedy or the usual fanfare, but with silence. Good silence. The kind of silence that follows truth. After the camera stopped rolling, something extraordinary happened. The audience didn't leave. They stayed, many of them approaching Thomas to shake his hand, to thank him, to share their own stories of loss and heroism.
Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, watching Thomas interact with people, a small smile on her face. Jimmy Fallon found himself standing next to her. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for showing us what it means to really save someone." She looked up at him with wise eyes. "Mr. Fallon," she said, "my house was not the only thing that burned that night. Mr. Thomas's heart was burning too, with guilt and sadness."
Tonight, we put out that fire. 3 months later, The Tonight Show received a letter. It was from Thomas McKenzie, now living in a small apartment in Queens, working part-time at a community center teaching fire safety to kids. The letter was brief. "Dear Jimmy and The Tonight Show family, Mrs. Chen was right. Some fires burn for months after the flames go out. Thank you for helping to put out mine. The watch runs perfectly, by the way. And every time I look at it, I remember what your dad taught you and what you taught me. Some things are worth losing if it means someone else gets to keep everything. But the most important thing I learned that night wasn't about loss or heroism or even friendship. It was about the power of telling our stories. Because when we share our deepest pain, sometimes we discover it wasn't pain at all. It was love disguised as loss. Thank you for giving me the space to tell my story. And thank you for reminding me that the best stories don't end with what we lose. They end with what we find. With gratitude, Thomas McKenzie, FDNY, retired. P.S. Mrs. Chen and I have tea every Tuesday now. She's teaching me to play mahjong. I'm terrible at it, but she says I'm improving. Some lessons take time." The letter now hangs framed in Jimmy Fallon's dressing room, next to a photograph from that night. Thomas and Mrs. Chen standing together on The Tonight Show stage, both smiling, both holding pieces of each other's stories. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in television happen not when everything goes according to plan, but when two strangers discover they've been saving each other all along. But the story didn't end that night in Studio 6B. The episode aired 6 weeks later, unedited in its raw emotional entirety. Network executives had initially hesitated, worried that 30 minutes of genuine human emotion might not fit the typical late-night format. They were wrong. The episode became the highest-rated Tonight Show in 3 years, but more importantly, it sparked something unprecedented. Within hours of airing, #Firefighter Thomas was trending worldwide. But these weren't typical social media reactions. People weren't sharing memes or jokes. They were sharing their own stories of sacrifice, of loss that led to unexpected discovery, of moments when strangers became angels. A teacher in Ohio posted about spending her own money on school supplies while struggling to pay rent. A nurse in Texas shared how she'd worked double shifts during COVID while her own mother was dying in a different hospital. A construction worker in Michigan told the story of missing his daughter's wedding to help rebuild homes destroyed by a tornado. Each story began the same way. Like Thomas McKenzie, I thought I had lost everything, but I learned. Jimmy Fallon watched these stories pour in from his apartment at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, overwhelmed by what had been unleashed. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers, all saying the same thing. Thank you for showing us what television can be. But the most important call came from an unexpected source. "Mr. Fallon?" The voice was shaky, elderly. "This is Dorothy McKenzie, Thomas's mother." Jimmy sat up in bed, fully alert. "Mrs. McKenzie, how are you?" "How is Thomas?" "That's why I'm calling," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I need to tell you something about my son that he would never tell you himself." Over the next 20 minutes, Dorothy McKenzie painted a picture of a man who had been quietly heroic his entire life. How at age 8, Thomas had rescued a drowning kitten from a storm drain. How in high school, he'd worked 3 jobs to help pay for his younger sister's medical bills. How he'd proposed to his wife, Sarah, in the very firehouse where he would later serve for 30 years. But the thing you need to understand, Dorothy continued, is that Thomas has been carrying guilt about that fire for 3 months. Not because he lost his belongings, but because he thinks he chose Mrs. Chen over his own family's memories. Jimmy felt a knot form in his stomach. "What he doesn't know," Dorothy said, "is that Sarah and I went through those ashes the day after the fire. We found things. Not everything, but important things. We've been keeping them secret, waiting for the right moment to show him." "What kind of things?" Jimmy asked. "His father's badge. It was in a fireproof safe he'd forgotten about. Some of Sarah's jewelry. A few photographs that were protected by glass frames. And something else. Something that would mean everything to him." Dorothy's voice cracked slightly. The last letter his father wrote him before he died. Thomas was overseas in Iraq at the time, serving as a military firefighter. The letter was in the safe too. We've been waiting for him to stop blaming himself before we showed him these things. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, processing what this meant. "Mrs. McKenzie," he said finally, "would you be willing to come on the show again to give him these things?" "I was hoping you'd ask," she replied, "because watching my son that night, seeing him finally let go of that guilt, I realized something. Sometimes the people who save others need to be saved too." 2 weeks later, Thomas McKenzie walked back onto the Tonight Show stage, this time accompanied by his wife Sarah, a warm woman with kind eyes who had supported him through 30 years of dangerous work. They had been invited back, Jimmy explained to the audience, to share an update on how the original episode had impacted their lives. Thomas looked healthier, more at peace than he had during his first appearance. He spoke about the overwhelming response from viewers, about the fund that Mrs. Chen had helped establish for firefighters who'd suffered personal losses in the line of duty, about the therapy he'd finally started to address his survivor's guilt. But most importantly, Thomas said, looking directly at Jimmy, "I learned that heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up even when you're broken." The audience applauded, but Jimmy raised his hand gently. "Thomas, there's something else we need to talk about tonight. Something you don't know." From the wings of the stage, Dorothy McKenzie appeared, carrying a wooden box that was clearly heavy with more than just physical weight. Thomas's face went pale. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Dorothy approached her son with tears already forming in her eyes. "Tommy," she said, using the childhood nickname she'd called him for 58 years, "your father would be so proud of the man you became, but he'd also be disappointed in the guilt you've been carrying." She set the box down on Jimmy's desk and opened it carefully. Inside, clearly visible to the cameras and the audience, were items that Thomas thought had been lost forever. His father's FDNY badge, gleaming as if it had just been polished. Sarah's grandmother's wedding ring. Photographs of Thomas as a young recruit standing proudly next to his father. But it was the final item that broke him completely. Dorothy pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in handwriting that Thomas recognized immediately. "This is from your father," Dorothy said softly. "The last letter he wrote you before his heart attack. The one that arrived the day after he died, while you were serving in Iraq. You read it once and said you couldn't bear to read it again." Thomas's hands trembled as he took the envelope. "Would you like me to read it?" Dorothy asked gently. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. Dorothy unfolded the letter carefully and began to read. "My dearest son Tommy, by the time you read this, I pray you're safe and coming home soon. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a firefighter, especially now that you're serving overseas, protecting people in a different kind of fire. I want you to know something that I never told you directly. Being a firefighter isn't about the fires you put out or the people you save. It's about the willingness to run toward danger when everyone else runs away. It's about understanding that sometimes, to save others, we risk everything we hold dear. But here's what I learned in 40 years of this job, son. The things that matter most can never really be destroyed. Love doesn't burn. Courage doesn't burn. The impact you have on other people's lives doesn't burn. I know there will come a day when you face an impossible choice, when saving someone else might cost you something precious. When that day comes, I want you to remember this: a true hero doesn't calculate the cost. A true hero just acts. The greatest honor of my life wasn't the commendations or the recognition. It was watching you grow into a man who would choose this path, knowing how dangerous it is, because you understand that some things are worth the risk. Whatever you lose in service to others, know that it was never really lost. It was transformed into something greater. The lives you saved, the families you kept whole, the community you protected. I love you, son. Come home safe. And remember, the McKenzie men don't just fight fires. We light the way for others.
All my love, Dad. The studio was completely silent except for the sound of quiet crying. Thomas was sobbing openly now, holding the letter against his chest. But Dorothy wasn't finished. "Tommy," she said, reaching back into the box, "there's one more thing." She pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. As she unwrapped it, the studio lights caught the gleam of metal. It was a firefighter's helmet, clearly vintage, with McKenzie SR painted on the front. "Your father wore this helmet for 25 years, Dorothy said. "He always said it would go to you when you were ready for it."
Not when you joined the department, but when you truly understood what it means to be a firefighter. She placed the helmet in Thomas's hands. "After watching you on this show 3 weeks ago, seeing you finally understand that being a hero sometimes means losing everything to save someone else, I knew you were ready." Thomas looked at the helmet, then at his mother, then at Jimmy, then at the audience that was now standing in ovation. "But I failed," Thomas whispered. "I couldn't save my own home." "No, son," Dorothy said firmly, "you didn't fail. You succeeded in the most important way possible. You chose a stranger's life over your own possessions. You chose love over loss. You chose exactly what your father would have chosen." Jimmy Fallon, who had started this segment thinking he was simply giving a follow-up to a heartwarming story, found himself witnessing something that transcended television entirely. "Thomas," Jimmy said, standing and walking over to where the family stood, "I need to tell you something. In all my years of doing this show, I've never seen anything like what happened here 3 weeks ago. But what's happening right now is even more powerful." He gestured to the audience, to the cameras, to the entire studio. "You think you lost everything in that fire, but look around you. Look at what you actually created. You created a moment that reminded millions of people what heroism looks like. You created a conversation about sacrifice and service. You created a fund that's already helped dozens of other first responders. You created hope." Jimmy's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "But most importantly, you created proof that sometimes what we think is our greatest failure is actually our greatest triumph." The episode ended with something that had never happened in late-night television history: a 3-generation embrace between Thomas, his mother, and his wife, standing center stage, surrounded by the artifacts of a life dedicated to service. But the real ending came 6 months later in a letter that Thomas wrote to Jimmy. "Dear Jimmy, today marks 1 year since the fire that I thought destroyed my life. Instead, it led me to the most important discovery of my career, that heroes aren't measured by what they save, but by what they're willing to lose. I'm writing this letter from my new apartment, which I was able to afford thanks to Mrs. Chen's incredible generosity and the fund that was established after our show. But more than that, I'm writing as someone who finally understands what my father was trying to teach me in that last letter. The McKenzie men don't just fight fires, we light the way for others. Thank you for giving me the stage to finally understand that lesson. Your friend, Thomas McKenzie, FDNY, retired. P.S. Mrs. Chen and I still have tea every Tuesday. She's gotten much better at mahjong, but I think she still lets me win sometimes. Sarah says that's what friends do for each other." The letter hangs in Jimmy Fallon's office today, next to a photograph from that second show. 3 generations of McKenzies standing together, holding pieces of the past while building something entirely new. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about what we lose in the fire. They're about what we discover in the ashes.